Welcome to History Uncensored. As always, I am your host, Seth Michaels. Today, we're doing a pretty cool episode. I think there's a lot of really good shit in here, so listen up. I'm just kidding, I love you. We're going to title this, Are You Not Entertained? What gladiator, when he is lain down in defeat and was ordered to receive the death blow, drawn back his neck? So effective is the force of practice, preparation, and habit. This episode is a history of gladiatorial combat in ancient Rome, the people, the places, the events, the ideas. Gladiatorial combat was not unlike that depicted in Ridley Scott's Gladiator, but for this episode, I had to go back and rewatch it just because it was one of my absolute favorites. This episode is mostly brought to you from one source, which is rare for this podcast. Normally I have 10 to 30 sources, but for this episode, pretty much just one source. The title of the book is Gladiators, Violence and Spectacle in Ancient Rome by Roger Dunkle. What a great name. The Dunks. So let's just get right to it, I guess. Gladiator games from the very beginning of their history in Rome were closely associated with funerals. The connection between a gladiator show and honoring the memory of a dead wife might be hard for us to fathom, though the presentation of gladiatorial combat was called by the Romans a munus. That's right, they called it a munus. Pretty sure I have the correct Latin pronunciation for that. But the Roman or Latin word munus meant duty or gift, and by extension funeral honors, an obligation performed for or a gift given to the dead. Georges Ville says that throughout the Republic, the word munus had the general meaning of spectacle, a show given as a gift to the people by Roman magistrates or even private citizens. Therefore, the word munus could also refer to the spectacles called ludi in honor of the gods, consisting of entertainments such as theatrical presentations, chariot racing, even a gladiatorial spectacle, which until the late 1st century BC was given only in honor of the dead. But by the early empire, the primary meaning of munus had become gladiatorial combat, driving out the general meaning of spectacle. The reason for this was the immense popularity of gladiator games. All spectacles were gifts to the Roman people, but as Ville points out, gladiatorial combat was the gift par excellence to the people. Ancients thought that performing this spectacle was a duty to the dead after they tempered it with a more humane atrocity. For once upon a time, since it had been believed that the souls of the dead were propitiated by human blood, having purchased captives or slaves of bad character, they sacrificed them as part of funeral ritual. Later, they decided to mask the impiety as entertainment. And so, those they had purchased and trained in what arms and whatever they could, only that they might learn to be killed. They soon were exposed to death on the appointed day of the funeral. Thus, they sought consolation for death and homicide. This was the origin of the munus. However, we can categorically disassociate human sacrifice from Roman funerals. There's really not too much evidence at all that the Romans at any period thought that any such human sacrifices were appropriate in connection with funerals. Gladiators, with their intense desire for victory and readiness to accept death only as a last resort, did not make good sacrificial victims, as we can probably conjure up in our minds. One essential requirement of an effective sacrifice was the complicity, either real or fictional, of the victim. Moreover, not every gladiatorial match ended in death. In fact, as we shall see throughout the podcast, many did not. One can't help but think, especially during the Republic when there was constant war, that spectators at a munus were reminded of Roman military success as they watched gladiatorial combat in the amphitheater, particularly with the appearance of gladiator types called the Samnite, Gaul, and Thracian. all recalling one-time enemies of Rome. One thing to remember always, these were people, they were captured or enslaved by Rome's quest for power, land, and domination. Always remember that these were people, slaves, some of them ex-military, but some were also civilians. They did not all deserve this type of death. There's little doubt, however, that gladiatorial games, even if they were not strictly speaking human sacrifice, were in origin funeral offerings in honor of the dead. The first gladiatorial combat at Rome was at the funeral of the Roman aristocrat D. Junius Brute in 264 BC, presented by his two sons in honor of their father. There are a few other details about the first munus at Rome that are worth mentioning. These details are from late sources, but they seem mostly credible. Such a shit show when you're dealing with sources after the fact. Regardless, the 4th century AD poet Ausonius writes that the gladiator show for Junius Pera consisted of 3 pairs of fighters, while Ausonius' contemporary Servius notes that these gladiators were captives. They were called bustari, that is, gladiators who fought at the place where the deceased was cremated, and bustarius was synonymous with gladiator, and remained in common usage at Rome at least until the time of Cicero. The 3 pairs seemed appropriate for a first-time event, with modest beginnings in a modest setting, while the identification of the gladiators as captives at least records with the fact that captives, that is, prisoners of war, were one of the primary sources of gladiators and slaves throughout the history of the games. It would be interesting to know whether these first matches were fights to the death. They probably weren't, but it's really almost impossible to answer. Moreover, Rome was in origin a warrior society, and militarism remained a primary characteristic of the Romans throughout their history. War was a high-stakes proposition, both for the Romans and for their opponents. Thousands, tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died in Italy and abroad in countless battles. Roman treatment of the enemy could be very harsh as well, sometimes even involved in the slaughter of non-combatants. For example, in Spain, during the Second Punic Wars, Scipio Africanus attacked the town of Liturgy in Spain in 206 BC. It had gone over to the enemy, and his soldiers killed all armed and unarmed citizens alike, including women and infants. In Rome, prisoners of war were often executed in public as a demonstration of Roman power. Even Roman soldiers were subject to harsh penalties. In order to ensure strict military discipline in the Roman army, serious infractions were dealt with ruthlessly. Consider the practice of decimation, which one soldier out of every 10 guilty of dereliction of duty was chosen by lot to be bludgeoned to death by his fellow soldiers. That's some shit. The harshness of Roman society was evident not only in warfare but also at home in the treatment of slaves. In fact, the cruel punishment of slaves goes a long way to explaining the Roman tolerance of gladiatorial combat. And this is the real reason we're here, to find out about slaves and gladiators and stuff. All gladiators, by virtue of their profession, were the property of their lanista. The lanista was the owner or trainer of a gladiator troupe, and thus, in effect, they were his slaves. Even a free man who voluntarily agreed to serve as a gladiator became a temporary slave of the lanista for an agreed period. And according to Roman civil law, slaves are considered to be nothing, with absolutely no rights. A slave was legally the property of the master, and could be sold by the master even if it meant that the slave was separated from his or her family. Slaves were usually branded like cattle to indicate their status and the identity of their master. One method of getting rid of an undesirable slave was to sell him to a lanista, a punishment for the slave and a profitable deal for the master. Everybody's always looking for gladiators. They were in high demand. Sick and old slaves were abandoned in the same way as some people today rid themselves of an unwanted pet, by releasing it far from home, usually in the wilderness, with no possible way of coming back. Sorry, Granny, you've been moving a little slow these last few years. We're going to take you, well, not necessarily out back. We're going to take you a little bit further away than that. We're going to leave you in the forest, and good luck to you. When offenses were committed by slaves in the household, the master was the sole judge and the jury. For minor offenses, flogging was the typical punishment. For serious crimes, the master legally had the power to impose a death penalty, which could take several cruel forms, such as crucifixion. Man, the Romans did love a good crucifixion. Burning alive. Exposing the slave to wild beasts. In the arena, ad bestias. The death penalty was sometimes applied to slaves whether they were guilty or not. When a slave committed a crime, such as the murder of a master, the custom was that all slaves in the household to be executed. During the reign of Nero, the prefect of the city was murdered by his own slave. When there was an attempt to carry out his traditional penalty, there was a minor revolt of the common people on behalf of the innocent slaves. The issue reached the floor of the Senate, which was divided over the justice for the penalty. Eventually, the slaves were murdered. The harshness of these penalties for slaves seemed to stem from the Roman fear of slave revolts, which had been launched with some temporary success twice in Sicily, 135 to 132 and 104 to 101 BC, and once in Italy under the leadership of... anybody? Well, yeah, you guessed it. Spartacus. It only lasted a few years, but Spartacus' attack on southern Italy was intense and involved the defeat of the Roman army multiple times. And the next episode that I'm going to do is going to focus heavily on Spartacus and his role in the slavery of Rome. Just really interesting. Can't wait to share that with you guys. The comment of Pliny the Younger, who is to be considered a pretty humane man, at least in Roman standards, on the ruthless punishment of slaves who had murdered their cruel and sadistic master is telling, and also representative of the typical Roman attitude in this matter. Slaves are ruined not by the judgment of their master, but by their propensity toward crime. As far as the Romans were concerned, slaves were not capable of moral behavior, except under compulsion. It's why, during trial, they were often forced into torture. As I said, slaves were nothing. They weren't part of any Roman community other than themselves. They were disposable people. Orlando Patterson writes about slaves of all cultures and periods, and he says, "The slave was natally alienated and condemned as a socially dead person, his existence having no legitimacy whatsoever. They were without the protection of law and were subject to whatever punishment a master wished to impose on them, without concern for the suffering that was involved. Thus, it's not difficult to understand why, given this attitude towards slaves, most Romans saw nothing wrong with gladiatorial combat." The prevailing feeling among Romans was that gladiators, given their background of slavery, crime, or opposition to the Roman state as enemy soldiers, deserved whatever fate that they suffered. This was also the Roman attitude toward freemen who volunteered their services as gladiators, willingly accepting a condition equivalent to slavery in what was considered a disgraced profession. At least a modicum of compassion did exist among Romans, but their standards in this matter were quite different from ours. The degree of compassion felt by a Roman citizen was determined by the status of the victim. The higher the status, the greater the compassion. The lower the status, the greater the indifference. In fact, not every Roman saw pity as a virtue, particularly in the case of convicted criminals who lost their freedom because of their crimes. And Seneca sees pity as a vice in opposition to the virtues of mercy and gentleness. Here he says, "All good men should display mercy and gentleness, but will avoid pity, for it is the vice of a timid mind succumbing at the sight of another's trouble. And so it is a common vice of every person of the weakest character, such as old women, and weak women in general, who are moved by the tears, the worst criminals, and if they could, would break open their prison. Pity does not see the cause of their plight, but only the plight itself. In view of this attitude, gladiators could not expect much pity from the crowd, nor were they given much. Mercy, perhaps, but not pity. On the other hand, the life of a gladiator did have some positives, at least compared to other types of slaves, minus the life expectancy. But it did have a positive side. For men who were desperate, it offered a hope of survival and a better life, but it did not naturally guarantee the achievement of those goals, which happens when you're put in an arena and forced to try and murder somebody else. Usually the other person is trying to murder you. The possibility existed that the gladiator could achieve some fame and dignity in the arena and even make some money. If he fought well over a period of years and was skillful and lucky enough to survive, he might be granted a full discharge from his obligation to fight in the arena and complete his freedom. This was rare. This is around the turn of the millennium. Healthcare is not good. And you're swinging around sharp, pointy things for, we'll just call it your profession. If you get stabbed or cut or poked or prodded with those sharp, pointy things, chances are it's going to hurt, it's going to bleed, and it's going to get infected. Just not many people lived a super long time. Because gladiators were so expensive, you didn't necessarily want them to die all the time, but it happened. There, that's that. You could eventually win your freedom, but it is not something that would come easy. And if you did win your freedom, it resulted in kind of a modified form of citizenship, from which he had been excluded because of his status and profession. Honor was available not only to winning gladiators, but also to losers. Spectators were witnesses not just of death in the arena, but also of life won back by losing gladiators whose efforts had won the approval of the crowd and the editor. Like I said, this isn't necessarily pity, but mercy. A gladiator who fought very well could, with the approval of the crowd, retain his life at the end of a bout. Even a gladiator whose request for life was denied could achieve some dignity in death. Spectators respected the gladiator who stoically accepted the editor's decision of death and submitted to death by the sword of his opponent. Such a death was honorable, similar to the death of a Roman citizen on the battlefield, and thus a kind of redemption from the disgrace, the infamia, that the gladiator had endured while alive by the mere fact of his occupation. Gladiatorial combat demonstrated the most fundamental of all Roman values, virtus, a word whose basic meaning is manhood, which came to mean courage in war. The Romans cherished legends from their early days in which heroes voluntarily suffered great pain and even death in conflict with the enemy on behalf of their country. Two legends dating from the late 6th century when the Romans were freeing themselves from Etruscan domination are well-known examples. Horatius Cocles all by himself fearlessly defended a bridge across the Tiber against the attacking Etruscans. As he drove the enemy back, the Romans destroyed the bridge, and Horatius swam back to the Roman shore. But perhaps the most inspiring story of heroic courage and self-sacrifice is to be found in the story of the Roman general Decius Mus, who, during the Samnite Wars of 340 BCE, solemnly dedicated his life to the gods in return for victory, an act that the Romans called a devotio. He charged on horseback into the midst of the enemy and was killed. Alas, the valiant act changed the tide of the battle, which ended in a glorious Roman victory. Although these stories do not directly relate to slavery, they do provide an awesome piece of historic sociological evidence on Roman life and their disposition. In this theme, virtus appears first in Cicero, which consists of a fortiori argument proposing that if gladiators, men of dubious moral character, could display virtus in the face of pain and death, then law-abiding, freeborn Roman citizens could find no better reason to behave similarly in a similar situation. What blows do gladiators who are either incorrigible criminals or barbarians bear? How they, who have been well trained, prefer to receive a blow than to shamefully avoid it. How often it is apparent that they prefer nothing other than to satisfy their master or their people. They, exhausted by their wounds, send a message to their masters to find out what they want. If their masters so desire, they are ready to give up and die. In this situation, has even a mediocre gladiator groaned? What gladiator has ever even changed his expression? What gladiator has either fought or admitted defeat shamefully? What gladiator, when he has lain down in defeat and was ordered to receive the death blow, drawn back his neck? So effective is the force of practice, preparation, and habit. At the end of his life, Cicero had an opportunity to follow the gladiatorial model of virtus when he was being pursued by Herennius, an assassin whom Antony had assigned to kill him. Although at first Cicero tried to escape in his litter. It doesn't seem like the best way to go about escaping an assassin is like, "Come hither, men, carry me away." But eventually Cicero decided to accept death by the sword like his ideal gladiators, achieving an honorable death. When Cicero saw Herennius running through the portico, he ordered his servants to set the litter down. He was accustomed, touching his chin with his left hand, stared intently at his slayers. His squalid and unkempt look, along with the anxiety on his face, caused the bystanders to hide their faces in shame, as Herennius killed him, extending his neck outside the litter. Cicero was slain. Also, I just think just not a good idea to try and run away from your assassins with other people carrying you and a... I don't know. That's silly. Maybe we'll eventually talk about some of the Roman emperors and such, because some of them have really interesting stories. I do know I intend to talk about Caligula and or Nero during this Roman fete that I have planned. Really, because they're idiots, and I can't wait to talk about them. They're hilarious in their idiocy. They were Roman emperors, but hilarious in their idiocy. But in the early days of gladiator games at Rome, Roman audiences no doubt also experienced this transition from terror to pleasure. A speaker of a practiced rhetorical exercise says that some Roman spectators felt squeamish and even turned their heads rather than see the wounds of gladiators. This speaker, however, also points out that squeamish spectators learn to tolerate the bloody violence and eventually embrace it when they experience what we would today call schadenfreude, joy in another's suffering, and watching gladiators, who in many cases were condemned criminals or, as I said, prisoners of war, get their just deserts, if that's your opinion, by risking their lives in the arena. As unattractive to us as the Roman mindset discussed above is, anyone who believes in the importance of history as a tool for understanding the human condition must be careful to avoid self-righteousness in judging the behavior of societies that have long disappeared. I am definitely prone to this, right? I definitely think myself above certain situations and, above slavery, but I've also mentioned before that I don't know how I would react if I was thrust or born into a society such as Rome and it was second nature. Just something to think about, and I just want to cover a couple of things and we're going to take a break. The long chapter of the cruelty of the Roman public shows may, perhaps, leave with the children of the modern world a feeling of self-complacency, yet it might well seem to ask ourselves, it is always well to do so when we read of slave trade, for instance, or of great religious persecutions on one side or the other, or of anything else which raises in us the question, is thy servant a dog that he should do this thing? Not merely what germs of feeling we may entertain which, under fitting circumstances, would induce us to the like, but even more practically, what thoughts, what sort of considerations may be actually present to our minds, such as might have furnished us, living in another age, and in the midst of those legal crimes, plausible excuses for them. Each age, in turn, perhaps having its own peculiar point of blindness, with its consequent peculiar sin, the touchstone of an unfailing conscience in the select few. Perhaps I am above it all, and perhaps looking back at it, maybe I wouldn't have been okay with the slave trade or whatever the case is, but unfortunately I don't know that. As I've said before, it's easy to look back on history and think of that. What is ultimately scandalous about the arena, though, about gladiatorial combat, is its banality. The brutality of the games does not express in sublimated form the brutality of civilization. This brutality instead participates in the production and reproduction of social truths with which violence is ultimately in accord. It could be argued that we modern people have less need for real bloodshed and death as our entertainment because we have been accustomed to accept realistic substitutions of those things in films. For example, such as the movie Gladiator or any other action film, right? Through films, televisions, websites, video games, and so on, even in books, that cater to a desire for violent and grotesque fantasies. And if you say that's not true, it's a lie. Sure, some people don't enjoy those things, but they wouldn't be being produced at the rate they are if people didn't, right? They didn't have that option in Rome. The option for them in Rome was to see real people going through pain, suffering, loss, and death. And one might object to these substitutions that are primarily directed at young males, though the popularity of such scenes goes beyond the target group and permeates the rest of society. Think about superhero movies, or think about other movies that impact the rest of society or have societal pressures. I guess something that a lot of people don't think of is what's the casualties, right? So think about in Avengers or in any other movie like that, thousands and thousands and thousands of people die. We don't hear about them. They're not real voices, but we are exposed to death and to scenes of death much more regularly than we would expect out of a normal life. Perhaps even more regularly, actually I'm pretty positive, more regularly than a Roman citizen was. It at least is the judgment of the controllers of these various media, who generally know their audience well, that these things are being done. It is also the conclusion of the news media, which doesn't target young males who if it bleeds, it leads policy can be observed daily on television and newspapers. It's hard to disagree with Cam Coleman when she writes of the human psyche's susceptibility to the thrill of vicarious pain. Remember that the difference between the Romans and ourselves on this issue is not the result of a sudden awareness on our part of the need for the more humane treatment of all human beings and animals, but the gradual shift in societal values that have taken place since the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to take a break, and I want to let that last passage digest with you guys for a bit. I want everyone listening to take the next minute, yeah, you heard me, the next minute, and think long and hard about the types of sin discussed. I also want you to think about what in perhaps 30, 50, or even 100 years from now may be seen as discussed from that generation of people from this one, right? It's hard to fathom, but legal slavery was abolished a little more than 150 years ago, and segregation, though supposedly suspended and gone, still rears its ugly head in modern American society. Pray tell me what you think will be seen as a sin in such a time frame. I'll be back momentarily to discuss who exactly these gladiators were. were these mysterious combatants? Who were the gladiators? Cicero identifies them as either men of no moral worth or barbarians. Speaking of men of no moral worth, Cicero probably would also include slaves in that discussion. The ancients believed that slaves were not capable of moral judgment. A slave's testimony in court was accepted only if it was given under torture. Slaves were bought by laniste on the open market and sometimes are sold by their masters directly to laniste. Usually as a punishment, the future emperor Vitellius once sold a difficult slave to an itinerant lanista, but relented just before the man was to appear as a gladiator and gave him his freedom. In fact, a significant number of gladiators were slaves. No shit, Sherlock. The men who fell into the hands of a lanista had little control over their destiny. They were the property of lanista. Don't think twice about that. Whom the Romans generally considered a heartless seeker of profit. Seneca compares the lanista with a slave dealer who fattens up his slaves like cattle and keeps them in good condition to get a better price for them. In one of his letters, Seneca puts the lanista in the same class as the pimp. I mean, they're both traffickers of human flesh, each a despised outcast from decent society. Since the 3rd century BCE, Roman conquest in the eastern Mediterranean and the Aegean areas had provided a steady supply of slaves to Italy, fueling an agricultural and pastoral economy that produced unparalleled affluence in Italy. Capua, the chief city of Campania, with its excellent soil and the influx of slaves to work the land, enjoyed great prosperity. I bring this up pretty much as a foreshadow of how Romans perceived the usefulness of slaves, as well as the foreshadow for the next installment of History Uncensored, Spartacus, the True Story. The training of slaves as first-class gladiators, along with the cost of their armor and maintenance, was indeed an expensive luxury. Campanian gladiators were considered the creme de la creme of the profession. Their stellar reputation was still evident in the middle of the 3rd century AD when a Muniarius in Minturnae, modern Minturno, proudly boasted of having ordered the deaths of 11 leading gladiators of Campania during his munus. Well, that's some shit. That's an expensive boast. The boast of Muniarius calls attention to how great his costs were in denying 11 appeals for release from such valuable gladiators, for whom he must compensate the lanista on top of their considerable rental fee. The superbia of the spectators was also engaged by their experience of schadenfreude, as they watched men whom they scorned degrade themselves by participating in bloody fights as entertainment. Appian reports that Spartacus's speech to his fellow gladiators in favor of escape from the ludus focused on this very subject, the shame of being put on view for the amusement of others. Plutarch, who was no admirer of Roman gladiatorial combat, criticizes the injustice of these men being forced by their owner to fight as gladiators. As a man well versed in philosophy, his views in this matter were in line with those of some other Greek intellectuals, but differed from those of the rest of Greek society, who, like the Romans, believed that gladiators, as men of low status and worth, deserved whatever fate befell them, whether it was an execution-style death blow, infection from the cut of a gladius, whatever. They deserved it. That's not my opinion, or Roman society's. Although most men became gladiators involuntarily, though it would have been like captured slaves, so on and so forth, there were free men, and later even women, who were willing to assume the life of a gladiator, hopefully temporarily. During most of the Republic, there was no doubt. Enthusiastic young men of the lower classes seeking fame and fortune in the arena that volunteered themselves. After all, they had little to lose. The stigma attached to the profession of gladiator, however, seems to have had considerable force in a society preoccupied with social standing and reputation. It kept men from the two upper orders, the senatorial and the equestrian classes, from fighting in the arena. This stigma was called infamia, or disgrace. Infamia could be incurred in various ways. For example, a judge accepting bribes, a soldier avoiding his duty or showing cowardice, and any conviction in court, such as bankruptcy. Infamia also applied automatically to anyone engaged in certain lines of work. Among these professions was prostitution, which doesn't come as much of a surprise as it doesn't come as a surprise at all. But also included under this censure was any profession connected with entertainment, such as acting, or fighting as a gladiator or an arena hunter. In the theaters, arenas, and brothels of Rome, the infamous sold their own flesh. In the case of actors, gladiators, and prostitutes, and the flesh of others, for pimps and trainers of gladiators were also stigmatized. They lived by providing sex, violence, and laughter for the pleasure of the public, a licentious affront to Roman gravitas. By the early empire, however, even the threat of infamia was not sufficient to deter significant numbers of freemen from any class from becoming a gladiator. The life of a gladiator seems to have been especially appealing to the financially desperate, the financially destitute, those who are at the last leg and the last hope, whose only hope to make some money was to fight for a price in the arena. In fact, becoming a gladiator was one of the most common options for those who were insolvent. Gladiator recruiters would look for handsome and well-built young men with potential as a sword fighter. No doubt painted an overly positive picture of life as a gladiator to entice them. Such young men were not just of the lower classes, but also eventually the upper orders of society. Many of the elite volunteers, having acquired an addiction to luxury in their upbringing, had managed to impoverish themselves very quickly. Young men who come from wealthy families of the highest rank, suddenly separated from not only their wealth but lacking even the basic necessities to sustain life in spirit, will not engage in everyday work, not being able to endure the drudgery of labor. Their only alternative is to take on a dangerous occupation that could cost them their life. Though insolvency was a problem, it wasn't the only one. It wasn't the only reason for signing up as a gladiator. Ville adds a love of glory, a longing to engage in combat, especially in times of peace, as well as more sinister motives. You know, the kind like a taste for killing and murdering people, sadism, and a death wish. Maybe they were bored with peace, and the desire to avoid the long-term commitment of military service, 20 to 25 years, and the need for a new identity have also been suggested. Carlin Barton has argued eloquently for a psychological explanation of the free-born Roman's desire to take up the life of a gladiator. She sees this aspiration as a desperate response to the devastation of the civil wars that brought an end to the Roman Republic. Others suggest still that there are shallower reasons for signing up. The splendors of arms, the ostentatious pomp of the scene of combat, the applause of thousands of spectators on the crowded benches, as well as a fascination of danger. Now, to do this, there was a legally prescribed process for freemen who desired to become a gladiator. A person who went through this process was called an actoratus, that is, one who hires himself out to another for a price. This process was also available to prospective wild beast fighters, bestiari and venatores. The first step was to declare one's intention to a tribune of people, who could either approve or disapprove. If they became approved, though, the candidate entered into a contract with a lanista, or directly with an editor of a gladiatorial show, a munus. The latter method was mostly for the upper orders, and the commitment was usually for one appearance only. The usual contract specified the amount of money to be paid to the actoratus, the specific length of service as a gladiator, and the maximum number of combats required of said new gladiator. Just as a slave could buy his own freedom from his master, an actoratus could buy out of his contract with the lanista. Or, if they were feeling particularly cowardly, have somebody else do it for them. The typical Roman attitude toward this business deal between Lanista and Octoractus can be best summed up in Livy's phrase, "The Octorati put their blood up for sale." The candidate solemnly swore to be burned, bound, beaten, and to be put to death by the sword, and to do whatever else was ordered. A total dedication of body and mind. The burning, binding, and beating were punishments that could be imposed by his superiors in the course of his training or even in the arena, while death by the sword refers to the losing gladiator's willingness to accept death at the hands of his opponent, if so ordered by the editor of the munus. In the late Republic, large numbers of freeborn men became gladiators, but by the middle of the 1st century BC, slaves still outnumbered free gladiators. What does it take to be a gladiator? To be a gladiator, you have to go to a school known as the ludus. The training of gladiators was serious business. Spectators wanted to see gladiators who were experts at the profession and could produce an exciting fight. The instruction they received in gladiatorial schools was famous for its high quality. Skill, discipline, art, all enable a gladiator to kill. Not only a crime is committed, but it is taught. What can be more inhuman? What can be more repulsive? Instruction makes it possible to kill, and once the slaying is accomplished, there is glory. The satirist Juvenal, in the course of his lampoon of a woman who undergoes gladiator training, gives an idea of what took place on the exercise grounds of the ludus. One of the most basic drills involved attacking a wooden post called a palace, on which they inflicted wounds with repeated attacks of a wooden sword and shield. And note here that the shield could be used as an offensive as well as a defensive weapon. These attacks, however, are not performed in a random fashion, but follow prescribed and systematic directions of a teacher of gladiatorial skills, otherwise known as a doctor or magister, standing nearby. The satirist Juvenal calls these directions numbers, numeri, which elsewhere are referred to as instructions, dictata. Although there is no clear evidence of exactly what these numbers or dictata were, in general, they must have been a predetermined series of offensive and defensive movements. A speaker in Petronius's Satyricon complains of gladiators who fought only by the numbers, that is, mechanically, although following these rules too closely might on occasion have resulted in a boring fight. Nonetheless, the dictata represented a crucially important facet of the gladiatorial art and could not be ignored. Julius Caesar urged trainers to impart the dictata to his inexperienced gladiators. Fans were familiar with them, and some would even try to help a gladiator who was not putting them into practice by shouting them from their seats. Sometimes this practice actually helped the gladiator. Not only trainers and those placed in charge urged the best gladiators to pay attention to the dictata, but also the untrained and amateurs among the spectators from afar, with the result that often the dictata suggested by the crowd itself are profitable to the gladiators. Later on in their training, gladiators would engage in practice fights with each other, though still using a wooden sword. At the most advanced stage of training, gladiators practice with opponents using real weapons. Trainees worked out carrying shields made of twigs that were woven in such a way to double the normal weight of their shield. The same goes with their wooden swords that were double the weight of real swords. The recruit treated the palace as an imaginary opponent, which was approximately the size of a tall Roman. A tall Roman at that time would be anywhere between 5'9" and 6 foot. The average height of a gladiator somewhere around 5'6", depending on what area of Rome we are talking about. The trainees pretended they were attacking their opponent's face, now threatening their sides, sometimes striving to cut their knees and legs. He would draw back, spring forward, and attack their imaginary opponent. They would apply every kind of attack, every technique of warfare. And in this practice, caution was observed so that the recruit tried to inflict a wound on his opponent in such a way that he in no way laid himself open to a blow in return. The living conditions in a ludus were no doubt substandard. There were complaints about the filthy conditions of the cells in which gladiators were required to live. The cells in the ludus at Pompeii were quite small, between 32 and 49 square feet. Think about that. 49 square feet is 7 foot by 7 foot. 32 is like 5.8 by 5.8. That's nuts. Accommodating 2 or at most 3 men, inasmuch as there were no beds, the inmates probably used straw mattresses. The ludus was not a prison as such. There were gladiators who were allowed to leave and return as they wished. Nonetheless, it was a prison for those gladiators who could not be trusted. And as a reminder, slaves generally were not trusted, so that would be most of them. They were kept in chains, or in a separate part of the ludus. Juvenal mentions a prison within a ludus. Fictional inmate of ludus, a free man who had been sold to a lanista by pirates, was naturally desperate to escape and therefore could not be allowed the freedom to come and go. He compares his ludus unfavorably to work farm, where inmates worked in chain gangs and protests the disgraceful confinement to which they were subjected. Even the rebellious Spartacus was allowed to live with his wife in a cell. A woman who lived with a gladiator in a ludus was called a ludia, or a woman of the ludus. The word often had a very derogatory meaning. The epia mentioned earlier is referred to by Juvenal as a ludia, which in this case seems to mean something like a gladiator groupie, a woman who formed a temporary relationship with a gladiator. It may be hard to think of gladiators as family men, but some gladiators had not only wives, but children. And those who were housed in the ludus, or sometimes even in a private house. In epitaphs, the wife is often mentioned as responsible for having set up the memorial for her dead husband. In one epitaph, there is a reversal of the favor. A veteran equus, or a horseman gladiator named Albanus, stationed at the Ludus Magnus in Rome, had set up a memorial for his dearest wife, Publicia. In another, a certain Euche, who set up a memorial for her gladiator husband Faustus, is called a counternormalis. One could not contract a legal marriage with a slave, so a man and his slave partner who lived under the same roof were referred to as counterbanales, literally sharing the same tent. Something like akin to our common law spouse laws today. The social structure of the ludus reflected the Roman love of organization and hierarchy. Each category of gladiators was divided into 4 segments, named after the post used for training exercises. First, second, third, and fourth palace. Gladiators of the same gladiatorial type were ranked in these hierarchical groups according to the number of times they had been victorious in the arena. So the more wins you had, the higher you were ranked in the ludus and the more control you had over the men. For example, all of the Thraces in the school were divided in these 4 ranks. The Familia Gladiatoria in a ludus was multi-ethnic. Their native lands were widely scattered across the empire, from Spain to the near and far Middle East. Eastern gladiators frequently made their way west and vice versa. Despite the cultural and language differences, emotional attachments often perpetuated among gladiators. It was pretty common. There were numerous examples of surviving comrades paying for the burial of their cellmates, and sometimes all the cellmates of the troop chipped in to pay for the burial. There's an example set up by a Peltrates, spelling of the common gladiator name Petrates, and other cellmates in the ludus for the beloved colleague Hermes, not the Hermes celebrated by Martial, like the near legendary gladiator. An extraordinary example of loyalty among gladiators is an epitaph telling of members of troops, some of these Latin words, Pagniari, I butcher this shit, in the Ludus Magnus, who paid for the burial of one of their fellow Pagniari. What is unusual about this act is that the deceased, Secundus, had died at the age of 98. And need I remind you that the normal time people died was in their 20s, or that was the average. Obviously, you're going to have outliers. And Secundus was obviously an outlier. 98 years old. That's old as fuck for today's standard. That's 5 or 6 decades after the end of his career. It wasn't unusual for friendships to be formed not just among gladiators of the same type, but also across types. Since members of the same familia fought each other in the arena, it was not uncommon for friends to be matched against each other. And this is pretty sad. Seneca writes of men in the ludus living with each other and fighting each other. Cicero notes that Mirmillo killed a Thrax who was his friend. No doubt the pairings in some cases even involved 2 cellmates. An inscription from Rome mentions Rotarius and Marmello as cellmates, a possible pairing in the arena. Helmets with visors that covered the face made it easier to wound and kill an opponent, who in some cases was a close friend. You have a cellmate and you're living in a space 49 square feet, 7 feet by 7 feet. So you're living in close quarters. You are in constant contact with that person. I can't even imagine the soul-wrenching deal it must have been to try and get up and fight that person whom you've not only trained with, but developed an impossibly strong bond. The unfortunate part is if the two men didn't fight and they kind of just did not give a good show, it was possible for both gladiators to be put to death. And if you won, there is ranking at stake, right? There's glory and there's possible money. But let's take a break as we try to consider what it must have been like to live in this world. Contemplate the friendships, the horrors, the glory of victory, and the pain. Thus was the life of the gladiator. Now let us find out what all the fuss was about. Let's take a look at gladiator games in action. Let us resume. When we left, we were talking about what it was like to be a gladiator. What was it like leading up to the events of the Gladiatorial show? The emotional involvement of people with a munus began when the show was first advertised, and grew to a fever pitch until the munus took place. The anticipation might be compared to a child's impatient wait for Christmas to come. Seneca uses the example of an approaching munus to illustrate the psychological condition of someone anticipating a future pleasure. Just as when the day of a gladiatorial munus is announced, they wish that the intervening days fly by. Every delay of an anticipated event is impossibly long. There in Plataea, a city in Greece, we heard frequent rumor about a certain Democeres who was about to give a gladiatorial munus. He was a man from the noblest of families and extremely wealthy and outstanding in his generosity. He was going to provide pleasures for the people with a splendor worthy of his wealth. Who has a sufficient gift of eloquence to be able to describe in suitable words each and every aspect of the varied magnificence of his show? It would appear that the speaker has seen an advertisement of the munus and cannot contain their enthusiasm. Beside the guarantee of significant bloodshed and death, the central attraction, the editor had promised the appearance of dwarf gladiators and a female chariot fighter. As exotic sideshows, perhaps even more tantalizing is the scheduled execution of a slave steward for having had sex with his master's wife. As a feature of the venatio, he will be thrown to the wild animals ad bestias. But what is even better, his execution will provoke a dispute between two factions within the crowd. One faction consists of jealous husbands expressing satisfaction at the death of a slave caught in adultery with his master's wife. The other, characterized as lovers, will support the slave, excusing him because the master's wife is a slut and had probably forced him to have sex with her. No doubt, many public executions were routine and not terribly interesting to the crowd, but here, the acquaintance of the spectators with the details of the slave's offense and the different opinions about the execution would make this event even more interesting and exciting. Just had to figure out ways to drum up, stuff in ancient Rome. It's not like, they could just go to the zoo. Zoos didn't exist. It's not like they could go ice skating. They can't bring ice from somewhere, at least not efficiently. It's not like they could go play sports. They didn't really have too many sports. You get the idea. So when the option was there to watch somebody be horribly murdered in an arena, it was fair game. Another component of the preparation for the munus was the so-called free dinner. This is really cool. This is pretty interesting. which was given by the editor and took place on the eve of the spectacle. The word free, as applied to cena, suggests to us a dinner you do not have to pay for. Liber, however, is not used in this sense in Latin, but means something like limitless or free from restriction. As applied to cena, it probably had a double connotation, a dinner unlimited in quantity at which one can indulge one's appetite to the fullest. The invitees were all the participants in the next day's munus: gladiators, beast fighters, condemned criminals, or known as damnati, who were to be put to death in the arena the next day. The custom seems to be in the tradition of the condemned man's last meal, but this was only true of the damnati, because if you were a gladiator, there was a pretty decent chance that you would live through the following day, and hopefully not have your viscera spilled over the sand. The Cena Libera was often held in a public place such as the town forum, with tables set out in the open air. The meal would have taken place in the late afternoon, and the public was invited to observe the participants in this dinner and even talk to them. The location and the involvement of the public suggest another purpose of the Cena: advertisement. It's all about marketing money, baby. The munus would take place, or at least begin, on the next day, and the anticipation of the show was pushed to a peak by this dinner. If the public had any doubt about attending, the Cena might change their minds. Up until the early Empire, gladiatorial combat and the venatio were, for the most part, standalone events, but a kind of natural attraction gradually brought them together so that eventually the venatio joined with the gladiator show in the same day-long event. You might be asking me, what the fuck is venatio, Seth? I'm about to tell you. Calm down. Slow your roll. Right? The venatio had much in common with gladiatorial combat. I mean, it had a lot, right? And you'll figure it out. Both involved violent fights that could end in death for either opponent. What? The lives of gladiators, beast fighters, and even their animal opponents could be spared by the munerius because of courageous fighting. All these arena performers could win fame and glory by outstanding performances in the arena. The primary meaning of the word venatio was hunt in the wild, but applied to a spectacle, it meant a staged hunt in the arena. As a spectacle, the venatio featured human hunters attempting to kill animals of all kinds and sizes, but especially large and dangerous predators such as lions, tigers, leopards, bears, and even elephants. An interesting fact about this is Rome's thirst for gladiatorial games and combat in venatio was so much so that some of these lions and elephants were hunted to near extinction or to extinction within the time of the Roman Empire. I shouldn't say cool fact, shitty fact, but a fact nonetheless. There were two kinds of beast fighters that fought in a venatio: a venator, or a hunter, and a bestiaris, literally a beast man, one who fought wild animals. The difference has been interpreted variously, but I believe that at least during the Republic, it was mostly a matter of equipment and dress. The venator wore no armor, and his weapons were venabulum and the lancia. The venabulum was a thrusting spear, and the lancia was a light throwing spear, whereas the bestiaris resembled a gladiator with a helmet, shield, and sword. Although Italian hunters hunted small prey, and even some larger prey like boar in Italy, they did not have the experience of dealing with kinds of large and dangerous predators that were imported from North Africa and other parts of the empire. It's not surprising that during the first century or so of the venatio, native hunters were imported along with their prey. These foreign hunters were familiar with the hunting of large prey such as lions, leopards, and elephants. In one example, in 93 BCE, Sulla gave a venatio in which 100 lions, a gift of King Bocchus in Mauritania, or modern Morocco, were for the first time allowed to range freely in the arena. The king also sent native Mauritanian spear throwers, no doubt because of their expertise in hunting these animals. There were probably no hunters available in Italy who could have served as worthy opponents to the lions. Probably not. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus imported 100 Ethiopian hunters to fight the same number of Numidian bears. That makes sense. It's also a shame that, when you think about it, these Many of these hunters would go on to die in the venatio. They were imported strictly as slaves to perform at the pleasure of Romans. When Pompey staged a venatio that involved a group of 20 elephants, he brought in skilled Gaetulian hunters. When crocodiles were first exhibited in Rome sometime in the late 1st century or early 1st century AD, they were escorted by crocodile hunters from the Egyptian town of Tintagera, who supervised their display in their arena. Imported hunters with long familiarity with their prey probably served another purpose, the feeding and care of the animals before the show. By the 1st century AD, foreign hunters whose skill were honed in real hunts in the wild became less necessary. It's been happening longer, and the care for these animals has been kind of standardized by that time. A class of professional hunters had begun to be developed in Italy who were recruited from the same sources as gladiators and trained in a school for arena hunters to kill large predators. Although the word venatio refers primarily to the battle between men and wild animals, it is also an umbrella term that includes a number of other events: animals fighting other animals, exhibition of exotic animals, executions of Noxi being thrown to the beasts, and the presentation of performing animals, much like you would find in a circus. Images from the famous Zlitin mosaic provide us with important evidence about these various events of the venatio. Sometimes those condemned to face the beast were bound to a stationary post in the ground or on a platform, or in a little cart where they were just kind of restrained from behind by an attendant. Another way of forcing damnati to face the animals was to whip them from behind. A similar technique was sometimes used on reluctant gladiators. Other than the bloody violence, there was a strong element of intellectual curiosity in the Roman fascination with the venatio. This can be seen in the pages of Pliny the Elder's Natural History, which has considerable space devoted to the animals of the venatio. Until the coming of the venatio, the urban population of Rome had little chance to observe the wild animals. Regardless of seeing the wild animals in Rome, they just didn't get out much. They were homebodies. There were no public menageries in Rome like our modern zoos, and Roman spectators were also fascinated by the behavior of these animals, whether in the heat of the battle or if they were performing tricks. Some animals demonstrated an intelligence that struck Romans as close to human. The venatio points up a paradox of the Roman character. They had an appreciation of the beauty, strength, and intelligence of wild animals that was in direct contrast to their assumption that it is normal and even admirable to slaughter them for pleasure. Which is really strange, right? And I wouldn't say that it's very frequent in the modern world where you find things like cockfighting or other animal fights. The closest I think we really have in America would be like the rodeo. But again, just an example of how societal preferences have changed over time. Augustus boasts that in the 26 venationes he had given during his rule, approximately 3,500 animals were killed. That's a lot. I mean, that's over 100 per venatio. He takes pains to point out that these were African animals. That is, he had gone to the great expense of obtaining them, shipping them, caring for them, only to be brought into the amphitheater for them to be murdered. And these weren't local animals like boars, they were lions and leopards. It's an impressive number. It was 3,500 is a lot, but it was far surpassed by Titus during the dedications of the Colosseum and his baths when 9,000 animals were killed, and later in the early 2nd century AD during the celebration of Trajan's victory over the Dacians, when in shows over a period of 123 days, 11,000 animals were slaughtered. One of the reasons that I'm talking so much about the venatio is because I want to get the point across between the correlation of the domestication of animals and slavery. If you haven't listened to my very first episode of the podcast that talks about this subject, I would really recommend you go back and check it out. It sets up some very important notes, some very important things for understanding slavery in its entirety. And this frequent reference that I'm going to be making that slavery is very similar to domesticated animals, and that because we domesticated animals, It really set civilization up for slavery, including the treatment of their slaves, how we treat them. Think about it: chains, collars, physical pain, branding them, marking them, so on and so forth, using them for physical and mechanical labor. The same things you do with domesticated animals you would do with a slave. The slave was just more efficient for most tasks. Also, beyond that, let's get back to Rome. The very first century and a half of gladiatorial combat, the show began early in the morning, and it continued throughout the day without an intermission. In 61 BC, however, a lunch break was instituted. During this time, spectators could leave the amphitheater, a custom that continued at least into the 3rd century AD. After all, sitting for 7 or 8 hours without intermission must have strained the limits of human endurance, no matter how popular the entertainment. There were some spectators, however, who were willing to stay in their seats during the break for various reasons. Perhaps they didn't want to lose their seats while they were out. Sometime in the reign of Caligula, or of Claudius, a diversion inspired by the popularity of the Adbestius, executions in the morning, venatio that had begun sometime in the early empire, was presented to fill the void between the venatio and the afternoon gladiator show. This is some fucked up shit. This was the event that became known as the noonday spectacle, meridianum spectaculum, which featured the execution of convicted criminals who were purchased by the editor from authorities. Like the executions during the venatio, the number of executions at noon depended on the quantity of convicts available at any given time. There were no doubt some munera which did not feature this event because of the unavailability of the victims, or the inadequate budget of the editor. Obviously, expense would not be a crucial consideration when the editor was the emperor, and thus, if an emperor held a munus, the number of executions, depending on the availability, was usually quite large, but in the rest of Italy, where munera were smaller in scale in comparison with Rome, the number of executions was much more limited. But I'm going to talk about some of these executions, because, like I said, it's fucked up. What one saw when they were at this noonday spectacle was probably naked men chained to each other marched into the arena as a prelude to their execution. Their punishment was that they fight one another to the death. Seneca, who I've mentioned several times now, strongly objects to the way damnati were forced to fight. They were armed with swords, but they weren't given a helmet or a shield, and that was the result that their whole body was exposed to their opponent's thrusts, which very often found their mark because he didn't have a way to block it. There was no need for the fencing skills of professional gladiators in these fights. There just wasn't. Seneca calls them pure homicides. A man who had killed his opponent was forced immediately to fight a survivor of another fight, and so on. In the end, all of them were killed, having carried out mutually their sentence of death. It should be noted, however, that Seneca is not protesting the death penalty for the damnati, but the savagery of the spectacle, which is far removed from the sport of gladiatorial combat, and its negative effect on the spectators. The fans of the noonday event preferred quick bloodshed and death in great quantity. They preferred inartistic killings to the contests of trained gladiators. Seneca, repulsed by the bloodthirsty behavior of the crowd, quotes the shouts of the crowd to attendants in the arena, given the responsibility of forcing reluctant combatants to fight. "Kill him! Whip him! Burn him! Why does he face his opponent's sword so timidly? Why is he so tentative in killing his opponent? Why is he so reluctant to die? Force him with blows to risk being wounded. Make them exchange blows with their unprotected chests." It should be noted that this method of executing prisoners based on gladiatorial model was not the only punishment carried out during the noonday spectacle. There were other, even more hideous tortures. Hanging, equuleus, which is a wooden horse on which the victim was mounted and then tortured by the application of pulleys and weights. A stake that is slowly pounded and driven through the back of the head that ends up emerging from the mouth. The tunica molesta, or known as the grievous tunic, made of flax and smeared with combustible substance like pitch, in which the victim was eventually burned to death. the frying pan or iron seat on which victims sat until their flesh roasted, and dismemberment by means of horse-drawn chariots sent in different directions. Drawn and quartered, anybody? As horrible as these punishments were, they were in fact not motivated by sadism, for the most part, but to promote the maintenance of good order in Rome, which, like other pre-industrial states, lacked real police or prison system. These harsh public executions sent a message to law-abiding citizens that the state was acting aggressively to protect them and murder them. There is also a psychological dimension to these drastic physical penalties. Public punishment was, by its very nature, humiliating because it allowed the community to be entertained by the victim's suffering. With his hands tied behind his back and a rope around his neck, half naked in torn clothes, he was dragged into the forum, suffering mockery consisting of words and deeds all along the Via Sacra. His head was held back by his hair, just as happens to condemned criminals in the arena, and the point of a sword was held under his chin to force him to hold his face up to be viewed and not let it hang down. Some pelted him with excrement and mud, and others called him an arsonist and a glutton, while other members of the crowd criticized the defects of his bodily appearance, his extraordinary height, his red face from excessive wine drinking, his fat belly, and one weak thigh because of a chariot accident. Finally, at the Gemonian stairs, he was tortured and put to death slowly, and then dragged by a hook into the Tiber. As a reminder, Rome was fucking brutal. Prolusio, before the gladiator fights began in earnest, there was a warm-up period. Just as in any modern sport, as a preliminary exercise, gladiators engaged in shadow fencing with wooden swords. In an analogy, Seneca contrasts the Prolusio with a real gladiatorial fight. How stupid it is to wave your sword in the air when you have heard the signal for battle. Get rid of these practice weapons of yours. Now is the time for real weapons. I've run out of time. We're almost coming up close to about an hour and 15 minutes. So I'm going to continue Gladiators. I'll probably do another short episode on Gladiators, and we're going to finish with that. I'll probably have 2 episodes within the next week, both Gladiators and Spartacus. So I hope you guys stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. And if you like the show, this is your first time, consider subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Those 2 things help me out more than anything. Also, if you would like any of your listener mail read on the show, all you have to do is email me. I'll have a link to my email in the description of the show, which is contact@historyuncensoredpod.com. You can always reach me at Twitter, which is Seth4Nerds, at Seth4Nerds, as well as don't forget to reach me and join my Facebook group. It's called Uncensored Podcasting, and you can find me there. But until then, guys, I hope you really are enjoying this expose on Rome, and I look forward to continuing it. Like I said, over the next week, there should be 2 episodes, hopefully, if time permits. One finishing up Gladiators, the second one doing Spartacus, and after that, we are going to be getting back into our history of women, and I am going to do what it was like to be a woman in Rome, with some famous women, some less famous women, some poor and good examples, so on and so forth. I'm going to try and cover the social strata of everything involved. But until then, this has been History Uncensored. I've been your host, Seth Michaels, and as always, history remembers.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.